As a senior editor for the New American Magazine, William Norman Grigg is a featured guest on numerous television and radio programs. Mr. Grigg is the author of Freedom on the Altar, the UN's crusade against God and family. He has also written and appeared in video documentaries such as Tragedy by Design and Injustice for All. Mr. Grigg's studies on the issue of ChinaGate and the White House connection began over 2 years before the national media discovered this information.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening, and I'm gratified that so many of you saw fit to share a little bit of your very precious time with me this evening, and I certainly hope that what I have to say, however unpleasant, and it will be unpleasant, will reward your investment of time. To set the stage, I think it would be a good idea to rehearse a couple of very important considerations regarding the nature of the administration which currently infests the White House. Just over the weekend, there was a summit of leaders from the NATO alliance. With no exception that I can think of, every single one of them was a socialist. Prime Minister Massimo D'Alema of Italy was on hand. Gerhard Schroeder from Germany. Tony Blair, of course, from Great Britain. Prime Minister Wim Kok from Holland. And, of course, Bill Clinton. There was a meeting held in conjunction with the NATO summit of the Democratic Leadership Council, which is the organization that produced Bill Clinton. At that meeting, Prime Minister D'Alema of Italy said the following: "There are words that in your civilization, in your history, sound difficult to understand or to accept. For example," he continued, "we belong to the Socialist International, and I'm aware that this word is somewhat sensitive here, and I can see that we have avoided pronouncing this word here, but we should prevail over this fear of words." Now, Mr. D'Alema's candor did not sit well with Bill Clinton, who avoids candor when at all possible. And Mr. Clinton leapt to his feet and said, "I'm not sure I would have you here, Massimo, if I were running for re-election." Duplicity, deception, and cover-up are innate in Mr. Clinton's makeup. Indeed, they are innate to the leadership elite that he represents. But let there be no misunderstanding here about the nature of the ideological convictions which animate Mr. Clinton and which animate the people who surround him. Those convictions are socialist convictions. They were adumbrated by Marx and Engels in the manifesto of the Communist Party a little over 150 years ago. That's something that we should bear in mind. A significant element of what we will describe tonight has its roots in ideological perversity, but there is something more sinister at work than merely misplaced idealism. Speaking of misplacing things, the Times of London reported just a little while ago, and I quote, "A new and wholly unexpected threat to world security cropped up briefly during this weekend's NATO summit when President Clinton dashed off from a meeting and forgot to take with him the nuclear football, a briefcase containing secret electronic launch codes for U.S. nuclear missiles. The football, a communications link with the Pentagon authorizing the use of nuclear weapons, is carried by and chained to a military aide who is supposed to remain just feet from the president whenever he leaves the White House, excepting, of course, those times when he wants to be alone with the likes of Monica Lewinsky, I would assume. But on Saturday, Mr. Clinton ended his International Trade Center meeting and sped off in his motorcade, leaving behind the most dangerous handbag in the world." Mr. Clinton is in the habit of misplacing very important things, as we will discuss in just a minute, such as, for instance, cruise missiles, which play into the ChinaGate equation in a way that I will describe briefly. Obviously, Mr. Clinton is somebody who needs constant adult supervision, and that is something that presents a very interesting state of affairs for our country. ChinaGate, digested to its essence, is treason and bribery, which is to say bribery in order to impel people who have been entrusted with our national security to commit acts of treason by betraying some of our most crucial defense secrets into the hands of a confirmed and determined foreign adversary, specifically Red China. Red China consists of a regime. We're not talking here about the subjects of the regime, we're talking about the rulers. We're talking about the criminal clique that presides over more than 1/5 of the human population, 1.2 billion souls, each of whom is as real and as vivid as each of us. They have the same dreams, they have the same desires. They were created by the same God, They were entitled to the same blessings of freedom. In the remarks that I'm going to share with you this evening, do not mistake me. Do not make the mistake of believing that I am trying to engender animosity toward the victims of that regime, because I am not. That is not my intention. I'm talking here about a criminal elite that uses means spanning the spectrum of coercion and corruption to accomplish their ends. What are those ends? About 5 years ago, Mo Zhuxiang, who was a highly positioned official in the hierarchy of the Communist Party of China, was asked by a Republican member of a Republican congressional delegation if the objective of the Chinese Communist Party was still world communism. Of course, replied this official, that is why we exist. The Chinese Communist Party has no meaningful existence apart from the promotion of world socialism. They preside over a slave empire and a military-industrial complex devoted to the expansion of that malignant idea. It is neither, in my opinion, arrogance nor hubris to say that we cannot be conquered by a foreign enemy unless we are first betrayed by enemies within our borders. I do not believe that Red China presents a military threat to the United States of significant magnitude that it could present us with an ultimatum at present. I believe that the fecundity of human freedom is such that when applied to matters of national defense as opposed to empire, we can protect ourselves from any conceivable foreign adversary, including the Red Chinese. However, if we find ourselves in a position where we are compromised from within, our national security can be fatally disrupted. And we can find ourselves in a position where we will have to accept a dictated accommodation with an insurgent China. And that is the possibility against which I wish to warn you this evening, and which I wish that you would warn your friends and acquaintances about in the coming weeks and months. We would not be the first country to be so betrayed by a perfidious ruling elite. As was mentioned in my introduction, my son is named William Wallace. Grigg, as it happens, is a name of Scottish provenance, and I am something of a student of Scottish history. One of my favorite poems by the great Scottish poet of patriotism, Robert Burns, is entitled "Such a Parcel of Rogues in a Nation." And this was written to lament Scotland's loss of independence, when it was not conquered on the battlefield, but rather conquered through the machinations of a treasonous elite in the top ranks of its government. Just to quote briefly here, I think this entirely applies to what's happening now with respect to ChinaGate. What force or guile could not subdue through many warlike ages is wrought now by a coward few for hireling traitors' wages. The English steel we could disdain, secure in valor's station, but English gold has been our bane, such a parcel of rogues in a nation. We're bought and sold for English gold, such a parcel of rogues in a nation. I propose this evening to illustrate how we've been bought and sold for Beijing's gold by a parcel of rogues within our own nation. How much gold are we talking about? Well, in this era of huge and almost unfathomable national deficits, we're talking about relatively insignificant sums. But then again, it doesn't take a whole lot of money if you're dealing with somebody who's willing to sell his soul in a buyer's market, as Bill Clinton has demonstrated he is capable of doing. Sun Tzu is the Chinese sage of military and strategic tactics and theory of warfare and things of that nature. The Art of War was written about 2,500 years ago. And Sun Tzu's insights, as I will illustrate this evening, tend to guide the ruling elite in Red China today, and they're eminently worthy of inspection by those of us who want to understand the objectives of Beijing. Sun Tzu wrote that a wise military leader will gladly invest, and I quote, a few hundred pieces of gold to purchase critical intelligence and to buy off people who are in a position to help advance the cause that the military strategist is seeking to accomplish. And Mr. Clinton, of course, was willing to put much of our national security on sale in order to achieve his own personal political ambitions. A short while ago, Premier Zhu Rongji of the Red Chinese government gave a joint press conference in the White House with Bill Clinton. And the subject of the allegations that Red China had infiltrated the American electoral process through the medium of illegal campaign contributions to Bill Clinton was a topic of discussion at this joint press conference. Zhu Rongji is an individual possessed of a certain wit. This is what he had to say in response to the allegations that Red China bribed the President of the United States, and I quote, "On the allegation of political contributions or campaign financing, I can also state in a very responsible manner that neither I nor President Jiang Zemin know anything about that." That, by the way, is something that we call in journalism a non-denial. He's saying, I don't know. He's not saying that we have discovered that this hasn't taken place. He's not rebutting the allegation. He's just saying, I have no knowledge of this. To continue. And we, too, also once asked the senior military leaders in China, and they told us they didn't have any knowledge of that. I think this shows that some Americans really had underestimated us. If the political contribution were to be really that effective, then now I have $146 billion of U.S. foreign exchange reserved, so I should have put out at least $10 billion U.S. for that purpose. Why just $300,000? That would be too foolish. Well, we don't know the exact amounts. The exact amounts tally somewhere in the millions of dollars. But it's interesting here that he attempts to deflect the accusation by saying we're dealing with relatively paltry sums. Once again, Sun Tzu said, only a few pieces of gold would be necessary in order to purchase critical intelligence. And so the question is not whether the Chinese managed to get, if you will, a rather large bang for the buck, but whether the bucks came from Beijing. That's the real question. And that's a question Mr. Zhu did not want to answer. Now, in dealing with the Clinton administration, we have to confront one of the most dismal realities of politics, which is that the same personality type you find in organized crime sometimes is found in organized politics, which is entirely logical because politics is all about controlling the power of the state. The business of the state is pushing people around and taking their property when it's not, of course, confined to its proper role, which is protecting their rights, protecting the property of the law-abiding. That's something that we're trying to bring about by way of restoration of the John Birch Society is a restoration of the proper role of government, which is to protect our individual rights. When it goes beyond that duty, all it is doing, of course, is rearranging the instrumentalities of coercion. So when the state is involved in coercing people, by and large, you're dealing here with a certain type of criminal personality. And in the Clinton administration, you're dealing with something that is not so much a government as an ongoing criminal enterprise. You've got graft, bribery, extortion, cover-up. These are the standard operating procedures for the Clinton administration, just to examine each of these in turn. Graft. Graft, of course, is the use of influence corruptly to benefit people who materially enrich you. The sale of seats on Asian trading missions to the Commerce Department is a perfect example of graft. What we call graft, the Chinese call guangxi. That's one of those expressions that have sort of infiltrated our language as a result of the ChinaGate scandal. For the Red Chinese elite, graft, once again, is standard operating procedure. They're of like mind with the people who are running the Clinton administration. Bribery. Bribery is what ChinaGate is all about. The receipt of bribes by the President of the United States in the form of these illegal campaign contributions so as to suborn him to use his powers of office in ways that injure our national security and enrich the people who gave him bribes. Extortion. The recently completed impeachment melodrama was just chock full of extortion. You had the spectacle here of a pornographer acting as an agent of extortion on behalf of the president and providing him with a character reference, which is something unprecedented in our history, quite frankly. You've probably heard the expression opposition research. This consists, of course, of an enterprise in which agents of the president avail themselves of personal information, sometimes compromising personal information from files, FBI files and the like, and then the use of this material to create leverage in the form of blackmail threats against those who would present a potential threat to the president and to his continued tenure in office. Larry Klayman of Judicial Watch is a legal activist who has unearthed much of the material dealing with ChinaGate. Referring to this enterprise of presidential extortion, Larry Klayman said the following: This has very serious implications because this whole information gathering scheme, in my view, is why Republican senators have been rendered little more than eunuchs on Capitol Hill. People are understandably afraid of this kind of power. You cross the White House and you end up with an IRS audit or are the target of a dirty smear campaign. It does help explain the reluctance of people in this town to hold the president accountable. Once again, does this sound like a government or does this sound like a mafia? I contend that it sounds more like the latter than the former. The art of cover-up. Once again, let's revert to the language of organized crime. In the mafia, there is something called omerta, or the oath of silence. In the Albanian mafia, it's called besa. In the communist version of the mafia, which is to say the ruling elites of communism, is called something else, but it's an oath of silence. If you're put into a position, we'll talk about that a little bit this evening with a specific reference to some of the figures in ChinaGate. If you're put in a position where by answering questions truthfully, you will injure the ongoing criminal enterprise, you have a duty under omerta or its equivalents to be silent even at the expense of going to prison. And there are several characters of that sort. Character is the wrong word. There are several individuals of that sort that we will discuss this evening. That, of course, is something which has been entirely typical of the Clinton administration. Louis Freeh, who is the director of the FBI, was asked in the summer of 1997, during the course of the Thompson Committee investigation in the Senate, about the scores of people who had refused to cooperate with congressional investigators regarding ChinaGate, people who'd fled the country, people who had taken the Fifth Amendment, people who had simply gone into hiding, people who had gone to jail rather than cooperating. Louis Freeh, the FBI director, was asked, have you ever seen such a spectacle in your life of people who were in a position to help an investigation simply refusing to cooperate? He said, yes, I have, but you have to remember I used to work with the Organized Crime Bureau in New York City. The FBI director is comparing the Clinton administration to the mafia. This isn't a right-wing extremist who is saying this. This is Louis Freeh. Then, of course, you have the spectacle of the Attorney General of the United States presiding over what is called, with some ironic wit, the Justice Department, who is acting as a relentless obstructionist at every conceivable juncture, including at some risk to herself in terms of jail time and fines. She has been cited for contempt of Congress because she refuses to turn over a key memo developed within the FBI by Charles Labella, who was heading up the investigation of ChinaGate within the so-called Justice Department. Mr. Labella said we need an independent prosecutor in order to investigate ChinaGate, specifically the role of Al Gore as the bag man for a lot of these illegal campaign donations. Janet Reno does not want to appoint an independent counsel, and so the House Government Reform Committee, headed by Dan Burton, subpoenaed that memo. Janet Reno simply refused to turn over the memo. She was hit with a contempt of court citation. She could end up going to jail for at least a year and paying a fine of $1,000 if she is convicted of contempt of Congress. This is something that goes beyond simple intransigence on the part of Janet Reno. We're talking about, once again, the dynamics that you see in an organized crime syndicate. Another thing that we saw at work in the course of the Monica Lewinsky scandal, which really, I think, was a delaying tactic employed by the Clinton administration, simply to wage a war of attrition against the public in terms of wearing down our attention span by immersing us in the sordid and completely irrelevant details of Mr. Clinton's personal misbehavior. But one thing we did see in the course of the Lewinsky scandal was Mr. Clinton's singular ability to lie. Some of you are aware of the phrase polymorphous perversity. It's a phrase that you can find in certain psychological textbooks. Bill Clinton is the master of polymorphous prevarication. His lies are cleverly wrought and intricately detailed, and they are wonderfully adaptable. They can adapt themselves to nearly any circumstance or set of facts. It is a gift. It's a diabolical gift. It's one that I do not covet, but it is a gift. And it plays a very important role in the ChinaGate scandal. Think of what we were told over and over again during the course of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Everybody lies about sex. So we shouldn't hold Mr. Clinton accountable for lying about sex, because sex is a supposedly inconsequential thing. I do not happen to agree with that assessment, but that's what we were told. The embedded assumption here is that if he would lie about something this inconsequential, certainly he would not lie about something much more consequential, like treason. Does that strike any of you as logical? It does not strike me at all as logical. I think his incentive to lie is far greater when you're dealing with matters of much greater consequence. His defense, when backed into a corner and asked about his conduct with Monica Lewinsky, was to say, I didn't think that I was lying because I didn't think it was sex. And the public bought this. Many of us didn't. As a matter of fact, I not only didn't buy this, I was offended that somebody was selling it, okay? But a lot of the public bought this. You couldn't say the same thing, however, and apply it to treason. I didn't lie about it because I didn't think it was treason. That doesn't really play as well now, does it? I don't think the public would have bought this as readily. The problem is that's exactly what Bill Clinton is trying to sell. During the Lewinsky imbroglio, Congressman Thomas Barrett said the following, quote, "It was not an offense against the body politic, what Mr. Clinton did with Monica Lewinsky." The problem here is the second part of what he said. It did not threaten our republic. It was not an offense against the body politic. It did not threaten our republic. ChinaGate does. And that is why Lewinsky was the topic of conversation rather than ChinaGate. After it was disclosed in late 1996 that the Clinton-Gore re-election campaign had received millions of dollars in illegal foreign sources for its re-election effort, thereby compromising our national security, and that in exchange for these donations, Mr. Clinton most probably made critical policy decisions that aided and abetted the source of these illegal campaign contributions, Mr. Clinton tried out the following rationalization. Quote, "I don't believe you can find any evidence of the fact that I had changed government policy solely because of a contribution." The problem here is that that is not the legal standard for bribery. You can have manifold motivations for taking a bribe and corruptly exercising your power in a way that aids the person who gave you the bribe. The problem here is that Mr. Clinton says that the key questions are all things that have to do with his subjective motivations. The same way sex isn't sex if he doesn't believe it's sex. Bribery isn't bribery if he believes that there is some other motivation apart from servicing the source of the bribes. You see, and it doesn't work that way. We shouldn't allow people to fall into the trap of believing that Mr. Clinton can define the terms upon which this discussion will take place. And too much that has happened in Congress, both in the Lewinsky matter and in ChinaGate, has followed that unfortunate pattern. One last thing I'd like to say by way of establishing the groundwork here in defining what Mr. Clinton has done and the things that he has been allowed to get away with has to do with Mr. Clinton's belief that in waging a war against impeachment that included smears, extortion, that included the subornation of subordinates, suborning perjury, that involved outright perjury, that involved at least 2 gratuitous and inexcusable uses of our military to launch distractions abroad. A couple of things I'd like to say about this. But in doing all of this, Mr. Clinton believes that he was defending the Constitution. Let's examine that a little bit. On March 31st of 1999, Mr. Clinton was interviewed by Dan Rather. He said the following, when asked if he had ever thought of resigning, or when asked if he thought that his impeachment, his status as the only elected president ever to be impeached, would stain his legacy. This is how Mr. Clinton responded, quote, "I am honored that something this indefensible was pursued and that I had the opportunity to defend the Constitution." February 19th, he had a joint press conference with Jacques Chirac of France. This is what he had to say when asked the same question. By being vindicated of charges, that is to say, by not being removed from office after being impeached, quote, "I think the Constitution has been, in effect, re-ratified." Let's examine that for a second. The Constitution to which Mr. Clinton refers is apparently now a re-ratified document containing a rather interesting amendment that says, "A president shall be regarded as immune to prosecution or removal from office for the duration of his high approval ratings." That is a dangerous proposition. Approval ratings, of course, are in the realm of pure democracy. Pure democracy is something we were supposed to avoid. We were supposed to be a republic ruled by the Constitution. And one of the critical functions in a republic of the public is to enforce the Constitution. We have to have an electorate that is informed and properly motivated, that understands the principles upon which our government was founded and understands the truth, and uses that truth to enforce the Constitution, to limit what government does, and to restrain it to its properly ordained functions. Let's talk a little bit about those high poll ratings, shall we not? Thad Bale is a political scientist at the University of North Carolina. He was asked by USA Today to explain Mr. Clinton's apparently impervious popularity. What it comes down to is that the economy is good, most people have jobs, and most people believe he's doing a reasonably good job, said Mr. Bale. He went on to elaborate by saying that while the public was properly mortified about Mr. Clinton's adolescent behavior, he said the following, quote, "It's not as if he sold the Defense Department to the Chinese." Well, no, he didn't sell them the Defense Department. He sold them the presidency and threw in the Defense Department as a bonus. And if the public had known that and understood this, impeachment would have turned out a lot differently. Furthermore, if he had been impeached for ChinaGate, Al Gore probably would have had to leave office before him. Because Al Gore, as I said a minute or two ago, was the bag man for a lot of the illegal campaign contributions. He seems to be reasonably respectable in terms of his personal behavior. But in terms of ChinaGate, he is more directly and personally implicated than Bill Clinton was. So Mr. Clinton was impeached for the wrong reasons. Yes, it was good he was impeached for committing offenses that are criminal in nature, that undermine the soundness of our legal system. He now stands to be disbarred, which, and here's a dismal reflection, with all due respect to the attorneys in the audience, if Mr. Clinton is disbarred, that means he is inadequately ethical to be an attorney, but he is still suitable to be a president. Strange little paradox here. We're going to be talking about a crime wave. I've once said that the Clinton administration is a crime wave in perpetual session. There has been a crime wave as well having to do with the pilferage of our national security secrets. If a beat cop patrolling a crime-prone neighborhood is discovered to have taken payoffs from the gangsters responsible for plundering the neighborhood, there are certain logical inferences that we can draw. We can draw the logical inference that he has been bought off and that he is no longer a law enforcement officer, he's an accomplice, which is to say he's a co-conspirator. We assert that Mr. Clinton, having received millions of dollars in campaign contributions from Red China at the time that this crime wave was going on, is a co-conspirator with Red China. As such, he is an enemy of our nation, by strict definition. He has chosen to do this in ways that have critically undermined our national security and tarnished the presidency. This is an unpalatable truth to be told to the American public, because when you start talking about the crimes committed by their president, that indicts the electorate. And so there's a natural tendency on the part of the electorate to flinch from these facts, because what we are saying is that on two separate occasions they had the opportunity to vote for this individual. They voted for him by pluralities, not by majorities, but by doing so, they elected an individual who is a criminal. This is not a popular message. We like to believe that the electorate, the sovereign electorate, is infallible. What we say in the John Birch Society is that the electorate, when properly informed, will exercise sound judgment. So it falls upon us to carry out the hard and unglamorous labor of informing them. How many people do you think in 1996, out of this electorate, which if properly informed will most of the time offer pretty good judgment, how many people do you think would have been interested in the endorsement that Bill Clinton's re-election got in August of 1996? We like your president. Who said this? Was it a labor leader? No. Quite the opposite, as a matter of fact. A politician? No. Was it a Hollywood celebrity? Not at all. It was Major General Ji Shengda, the head of Red China's military intelligence agency, that gave Mr. Clinton this unsolicited testimonial in August of 1996. He was speaking to Johnny Chung, who was one of the key human conduits through which Beijing pumped its illegal campaign contributions. We like your president. Well, from Beijing's perspective, what's not to like about Bill Clinton? What is there to like about Bill Clinton? Consider the headline that appeared in Newsweek on March 29, 1999. The penetration is total. The penetration being referred to was the penetration by Red Chinese espionage and military intelligence assets of our top secret weapons labs, such as Los Alamos. The Chinese penetration is total, said an official close to the investigation. They are deep, deep into the lab's black programs. Black programs are the top secret, cutting-edge weapons research, such as, for instance, the neutron bomb, and also electromagnetic pulse technology. The EMP, that's the electromagnetic pulse, would be an airburst nuclear bomb that would be used to disable just about anything that depends upon computers. Now that takes in just about everything. The EMP would do what the Y2K problem would supposedly do, which is to say cripple all electronic and computer-dependent technologies within a certain crucial radius. This would be particularly useful when applied to high-tech, what they call C3 command, communications, and control military assets in the battlefield, whether you're talking about tanks, whether you're talking about missiles, whether you're talking about aircraft. An EMP could disable all of it. And of course, Red China's military doctrine depends in great measure upon the ability to incapacitate information warfare on the part of their most likely adversary, which is us. I had mentioned earlier that Mr. Clinton is in the habit of misplacing important things, such as the football carrying the nuclear launch codes. Newsweek reported something that we had heard last August. I'm quoting now from Newsweek. Beijing recently got hold of 2 U.S. cruise missiles that failed to detonate during last fall's retaliatory attack on terrorist Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. This is really interesting for a number of reasons. I would say the most interesting thing that we know here is that attack on Afghanistan was launched as a transparent attempt to manipulate the timing of Bill Clinton's impeachment process. So you lob a couple of cruise missiles in Afghanistan, and China happens to end up with a couple of them, which of course they're now cannibalizing and using as a template for their own cruise missiles. That's a really interesting state of affairs. Was this a matter of misplacing something, or was it something more sinister? After we've evaluated the evidence this evening, you can draw your own conclusions. I have drawn my own, but I won't share them with you at this juncture. I quoted Sun Tzu earlier this evening. I will quote Sun Tzu again now to talk about the nature of Red Chinese espionage and the role that Bill Clinton has played in Red China's espionage during this decade. Sun Tzu referred to the 5 sorts of spies, and I quote, native spies, internal spies, double spies, doomed spies, and surviving spies. And Sun Tzu elaborated by saying as follows, native spies are those from the enemy's country people whom we employ. Johnny Chung would be a good example of that. He's an American citizen, naturalized American citizen. He would be a native spy. Internal spies are enemy officials whom we employ. Double spies are enemy spies whom we employ. Doomed spies are those of our own spies who are deliberately given false information and told to report it to the enemy. In other words, they're used for the purposes of disinformation. Surviving spies are those who return from the enemy camp to report information. When all these 5 types of spies are at work and their operations are clandestine, it is called the divine manipulation of threads, and it is the treasure of the sovereign. We contend that the communist Chinese, applying these tactics, have carried out a strategic coup of unprecedented magnitude by recruiting the President of the United States to serve as an internal spy, which by Sun Tzu's definition is an official of an enemy country who is employed by the spy master. We are not alone in that conclusion. Senator James Inhofe, Republican senator from Oklahoma, on March 15th of 1999, gave a dramatic speech on the floor of the Senate, portions of which I'd like to share with you now by way of giving an overview of much of what Mr. Clinton has managed to accomplish on behalf of Red China. I want you to listen. I am going to tell you a story of espionage, conspiracy, deception, and cover-up, a story with life and death implications for millions of Americans. A story about national security and a president and an administration that deliberately chose to put national security at risk while telling the people that everything was fine. If it was written in a book, it wouldn't sell because no one would believe it. If it was fictionalized in a novel, few could conceive it, but it is true. And then Senator Inhofe began to enumerate some of the things that happened. During the period of 1995 to 1998, President Clinton, quote, misled the American people on numerous occasions about the threat posed by strategic nuclear missiles. During this period, President Clinton made statements on over 130 separate occasions, such as the following, quote, for the first time since the dawn of the nuclear age, there is not a single solitary nuclear missile pointed at an American child tonight. Not one, not a single one. Parenthetically, one of the most tiresome things about Mr. Clinton is the way that he always uses children as a rhetorical human shield. Every single thing he ever does, from launching a war against Yugoslavia to promoting abortion, he justifies in the name of the children. And here, of course, we have him talking about how Red China, with malicious premeditation, was pointing nuclear missiles specifically at American children. But of course, it was no longer happening, according to what Mr. Clinton said. During this period of time, said Senator Inhofe, he knew that China was targeting up to 18 intercontinental ballistic missiles at American children. During this period of time, President Clinton signed export control waivers, which allowed his top campaign fundraiser's aerospace company to transfer sensitive U.S. missile guidance technology to China. During this period of time, he shifted the prime satellite export responsibility from the State Department to the Commerce Department, making it easier for China and others to get sensitive military-related U.S. technology. During this period of time, John Huang, Charlie Tree, Johnny Chung, James Riotti, and others with strong ties to China were deeply involved with the president's knowledge in raising Chinese-tainted campaign cash for the Clinton campaign. During this period of time, John Huang, who had been given a security clearance without a background check, was permitted to receive numerous classified CIA briefings both during and after his stay at the Commerce Department. And during this period of time, President Clinton was successfully stopping the deployment of a national missile defense system, exposing every American life to a missile attack, leaving us with no defense against an intercontinental ballistic missile. This is why the head of Red China's military intelligence says that we like your president. But to continue the Bill of Particulars, why is this a matter of life and death significance for every American? Because now Red China has, for the first time in its history, the means and the capacity to target the U.S. mainland, every city in the U.S. mainland, with ballistic missiles bearing independently targeted nuclear warheads. And by the way, I would contend that this alone would explain why Red China would say that it likes Bill Clinton. That is a capacity they had not previously enjoyed. Beijing has received Bill Clinton's personal intervention on behalf of the planned lease of the Long Beach Naval Yards to Costco. Most of you, I would wager, are aware of Costco and understand what Costco signifies, the China Ocean Shipping Company, the merchant marine of Red China's so-called People's Liberation Army. Costco, of course, is not simply a shipping facility. It is involved in smuggling and in espionage and in narcotics trafficking and in all manner of untoward activities. Long Beach was ideally suited as a port of call for Red Chinese agents of all varieties. The Costco deal has been held in abeyance because of congressional intervention. However, more recently we have discovered that a land swap is underway in which Los Angeles would pick up the contract so that Costco could use port facilities in Los Angeles. And as we will describe a little bit later, Costco is now establishing a beachhead on behalf of the Red Chinese at the anchor ports that guard the access to the Panama Canal. And this has happened on Bill Clinton's watch. Remember once again the image of the corrupt cop on the beat while a crime wave is taking place. If Mr. Clinton was unaware of this, he would still be culpable. But when the cop is receiving payoffs and looking the other way, it doesn't matter if he specifically knows what's going on, he's still a co-conspirator as far as the law is concerned. Beijing's military has had access to sophisticated military application satellite encryption technology that is so restricted that our allies don't have access to it. We'll talk about that in just a second. Red China is our chief military rival in the Pacific. It's a power whose military leaders explicitly refer to us as their chief adversary, yet it has been embraced by the Clinton administration as a strategic partner. And the two military leaders most directly implicated in the Tiananmen Square massacre have been drawn to the bosom of our military and diplomatic establishment on the watch of the Clinton administration. This is another reason why Red China likes Bill Clinton. Beijing has also benefited from Mr. Clinton's dereliction of duty in enforcing laws intended to discourage the proliferation of what is now called weapons of mass destruction. These, of course, are invoked anytime we're urged to undertake an arms control agreement or anytime some remarkable imposition is being made on us in terms of our national sovereignty. We have to fight weapons of mass destruction, which are being giddily proliferated by Red China with the knowing acquiescence of Bill Clinton. This is something that I find very disturbing. During a speech in Shanghai during the 1998 summit in China, the Bill Clinton-Jiang Zemin summit that was more of a grovel fest than a diplomatic meeting, Bill Clinton publicly adopted Mao Zedong's formula for China's reconquest of Taiwan. Bear in mind that we have gone to war, we've intervened in a civil war to bring about the independence of Kosovo from Yugoslavia. But we see here where Mr. Clinton is adopting Mao Zedong's dictum that Taiwan should be reunified with Red China. It's really an interesting contradiction. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. The United States, under Mr. Clinton's watch, has acquiesced as Beijing expands its military presence in the Pacific, specifically threatening a strategically significant and energy-rich archipelago of islands in the territorial waters of the Philippines. It is not well understood right now that China is, in essence, invading the territory of the Philippines. And it is doing so under the very nose of the United States, I contend, because the chief cop has been bought off. And the Clinton administration has, through official inaction, passively abetted the expansion of Beijing's narco-terrorism network. This is another very important issue in light of the fact that we are constantly urged to make all kinds of sacrifices of our liberty in the name of the so-called war on drugs. Beijing is, as it has been for decades, the chief kingpin in the international narcotics trade. Mr. Clinton has received hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars from Red Chinese sources that are directly implicated in narco-terrorism. That is a matter of some significance. Costco, once again, is involved in drug smuggling as well. Beijing's covert espionage network within the United States has expanded dramatically during the Clinton administration, including infiltration of sleeper agents or agents under discipline, saboteurs, terrorists. You know the menagerie. It has been growing by leaps and bounds during the era of the Clinton administration. Let's talk about each of these very briefly in course. This is done in order to establish what Red China has gotten in exchange for its rather modest investment in Mr. Clinton. Most of you are acquainted with what happened in February of 1996 when a communications satellite jointly owned by Laurel Space Technologies and Hughes Communications blew up shortly after liftoff in Red China. The reason why that missile was allowed to be launched carrying an American-made satellite was because Bill Clinton signed a waiver, an export control waiver allowing that satellite to be launched. Why was the waiver necessary? It was necessary because that satellite contained an encryption chip. Encryption chips are the key to computer-aided, satellite-guided information technology, especially military application technology. Very much coveted by Red China, the encryption technology. As a matter of fact, this technology was so highly classified and so privileged that Mr. Clinton refused to sign an export waiver allowing a similar satellite to be exported to Australia for launch. Australia is an ally of the United States. We have a treaty of alliance with the Australians. Red China is our chief adversary, but Mr. Clinton signed that waiver to allow that launch. In the aftermath of this disaster, technicians from Laurel and Hughes helped the Red Chinese conduct a post-mortem, and this involved the transfer of specific technical information that allowed them to perfect the launch reliability of the Long March missile, which is used to launch communication satellites. Now, why is this significant? This is significant because the Long March missile is the delivery vehicle for Red China's nuclear warheads. So by providing them with this particular technical information, they improve the launch reliability of the chief delivery system should we ever find ourselves under attack by Red China. This, of course, is a very dire state of affairs. The Pentagon certified in May of 1996 that national security had been harmed by this transfer of technology. In early 1998, while a Justice Department investigation was going on to determine to what extent our national security had been harmed and whether Laurel and Hughes should be brought up on charges for violating export control laws, Mr. Clinton quietly signed another set of waivers to cover exactly the same technologies, thereby undercutting the investigation by the Justice Department of this incident back in 1996. He was abetting a cover-up. He was abetting a crime by covering up through the issuance of these waivers. This was done, by the way, when Congress was out of session. Among the things recovered by the Red Chinese technicians in the debris of that Long March missile was the circuit board containing the encryption chip in that satellite. This was something that was misplaced by Mr. Clinton once again. Do you see something of a pattern here? I suggest that that puts into an interesting light the fact that we lost these 2 cruise missiles in Afghanistan that somehow ended up in Red Chinese hands. So the Red Chinese now have a launch vehicle capable of delivering a payload to any city in the continental United States. Before the intervention of Hughes and Laurel in February of 1996, just about every Long March missile that was launched blew up. Since that time, it has a perfectly reliable record of launches. They have perfected the means to deliver their payload. And during the Clinton administration's tenure in office, we've discovered that they now have a payload that they can deliver in the form of the W-88 warhead, which is used on our Trident missile. The W-88 warhead is a small enough warhead that you can put multiple warheads on a single missile. This is called MIRVing technology. They have the means, now they have the warhead. The warhead was stolen, apparently, from Los Alamos. This, of course, is something which has been in the news quite a bit recently. Paul Redmond, who is the CIA counterintelligence officer who caught Aldrich Ames, said that what was going on at the Los Alamos laboratory, weapons laboratory run by the Energy Department, was worse than the Rosenbergs. The Rosenbergs, of course, stole the atomic secrets that provided the Soviet Union with the means to build an atomic bomb. It was discovered that there were security problems at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in 1995. It wasn't until this year that the official responsible, or the official who was suspected of being the source of the leak, Wen-Ho Lee, was fired. The Rosenbergs were executed for their treason. Wen-Ho Lee was actually promoted, and he kept his security clearance after he fell under suspicion for being the source of the leak to the Red Chinese. And then eventually he was fired. His wife, by the way, we have just discovered recently, was an informant for the FBI between 1985 and 1991. I had mentioned the architects, the military architects of the Tiananmen Square massacre. August of 1994, Lieutenant General Zhu Huisi was welcomed in Washington. General Zhu was the fellow who gave the saddle-up order to the people who raided Tiananmen Square, the stormtroopers who crushed the protesters beneath the treads of tanks. It was General Zhu who did so. He was brought to our country, and at the expense of a little more than $13,000, he was given very good hospitality in Washington and in Hawaii. He was welcomed at the Annapolis Naval Academy and allowed to address the students at the Naval Academy. The Clinton administration, according to the book Year of the Rat, a wonderful expose that I heartily recommend, was, quote, prepared to say that Zhu was just following orders at Tiananmen Square. Of course, that phrase has a rather unfortunate resonance. They were also willing, that is, the Clinton administration was also willing to commend and to welcome the individual who gave the orders to raid Tiananmen Square. His name is Chi Hua-Tian. In December of 1996, Chi Hua-Tian was brought to this country and given a 19-gun salute in front of an honors cordon at the Pentagon, standing next to the Secretary of Defense, William Perry, at the time was the Secretary of Defense, who has his own connections to Red China. He was treated to the salutes of our men in arms, members of our armed services. The Secretary of Defense of the United States referred to him as my colleague. not my counterpart, my colleague. He sees his relationship with General Chur as a collegial one. General Chur was allowed to go to the National Defense University in Maryland. And during that speech, he had the temerity to say that not a single person was killed in Tiananmen Square. And nobody was willing to challenge him. In advance of General Chur's visit to the United States, the unclassified biography that was provided by the Clinton administration for the media was carefully sanitized of any reference to Tiananmen Square. It was carefully expunged of any reference to the fact that he had killed American servicemen in Korea. You have the Clinton administration here engaging in disinformation on the part of Beijing. Why does Bill Clinton earn the high endorsement of the head of Red China's military intelligence? I suggest that's as good a reason as any. I had begun my remarks by referring to Mr. Clinton's ideological inclinations and saying that whether or not he acknowledges them, they should be grouped under the heading of socialism. June 19th of last year, it was June 19th, 1998, Mr. Clinton, just before he went to China for a summit, was asked by a reporter in an Oval Office interview the following question: would you like to see the end of communism in China, and is that a goal of American policy? This is not a brain buster. There is an obvious answer, and that answer is one word: yes, or perhaps yes, of course, 3 words. 723 words later, Mr. Clinton hadn't answered the question. He referred to the need for coherence and stability in China, which presumably can only be brought about through naked coercion. He talked about how instability is something which is very wounding to the Chinese psyche, as if Mr. Clinton were qualified to assess the state of the Chinese inner life. The point here is Mr. Clinton did not seize the obvious opportunity to say what I think anybody who is not a studiously perverse practitioner of power politics, such as Henry Kissinger, or somebody who is not a bought and paid for employee of Red China would say, which is communism is a crime against the human soul, and it is the policy of our government to oppose it. He couldn't say that. By way of bringing this discussion to a close, very briefly, I want to go over the parcel of rogues who were involved in the buying of the presidency of the United States. Most of us know the roll call, but it's worth reviewing what they did and naming names and taking down for the record what they did in order to explain part to some extent why it is that Mr. Clinton has been so malleable in the hands of Beijing. James and Mokhtar Riyadi, the ethnic Chinese who preside over the Lippo conglomerate in Indonesia. They're from the Fujian province in China, which is one of the major recruiting grounds for Chinese gangsters, the triads. James Riyadi was the largest single donor to Mr. Clinton's campaign in 1992. ChinaGate did not begin in 1994, 95, or 96. James Riyadi gave $450,000 to Bill Clinton, and the Riyadi family also gave another $600,000 to the Democratic National Committee, or DNC. It was the Riyadi-owned Worthen Bank in Arkansas that gave a critical $3.5 million loan to the Clinton campaign on the eve of the 1992 New York primary. This was after the major bimbo eruption of Campaign 92 took place, the Jennifer Flowers disclosures. It looked as if Mr. Clinton was done politically. He got this key loan of $3.5 million from a Riyadi-owned bank. Once again, Mr. Clinton's connection to China goes back an appreciable distance. Now, the Riyadi money was critical in silencing Webb Hubbell in 1994. Webb Hubbell, of course, was an associate attorney general. He was a crony in the Whitewater operation in Arkansas. He confronted the prospect in 1994 of going to prison. He was penurious at the time. He was completely without money. He was willing to cooperate with the investigation of independent counsel Kenneth Starr to provide testimony, which would have damaged both Bill and Hillary Clinton. Suddenly, $600,000 in hush money is thrown his way in the form of consulting fees for unspecified tasks. The largest chunk of that came from the Riyadis. The Riyadis are once again the head of the Lippo conglomerate, which has been identified as a front, essentially, for the Red Chinese government. And both James and Mokhtar Riyadi have been identified as agents of the Chinese government. They supplied the payoffs to Webster Hubbell. Webster Hubbell, exercising the doctrine of omerta, remained silent and went to jail, rather than making a deal and staying out of jail. At this point, a competent investigator would have said, why is my key witness being silent? Where did the money come from to buy his silence? Kenneth Starr chose not to pursue that avenue of investigation. It would have taken him right into ChinaGate in 1994. Instead of doing so, a couple of years later, we ended up getting involved in this huge distraction called the Lewinsky scandal. That in 1994, had Mr. Starr been blessed with the rudimentary curiosity one would associate with a diligent investigator, we would have seen a tremendous amount of exposure being given to the ChinaGate scandal had he pulled on this thread, and he chose not to do so for reasons that he has not yet been asked to explain. In exchange for this payoff to Webb Hubbell, John Huang was inserted into the Commerce Department at the specific instigation of Bill Clinton. John Huang is an identified agent of Red China. He is the key to a lot of what's happened in ChinaGate. He was the Riyadi's man in the Clinton administration. He made more than 400 calls to various elements of their empire while he was working in his Commerce Department office. He made heaven only knows how many calls from a safe house located nearby. He received at least 109 classified briefings dealing with China, after which on many occasions he would literally go to the next room and give a briefing to the Red Chinese ambassador. He helped to eviscerate export controls on much of our high-tech hardware and software, especially the encryption technology, and he played the key role in coordinating this divine orchestration of threads that Sun Tzu referred to, working with all the elements of the ChinaGate espionage and bribery network to bring about Red China's objectives. It's interesting, he was deposed by Judicial Watch in mid-April. Judicial Watch, of course, is the legal watchdog group that has done a lot of the spade work in uncovering the ChinaGate scandal. Mr. Huang invoked the Fifth Amendment 419 times. I don't know if he did so when he was asked if his name was John Huang, but he invoked the Fifth Amendment when he was dealing with questions he had previously answered under oath, which means he doesn't have a Fifth Amendment immunity. If you've already answered questions under oath, you can't change your mind once you've agreed to cooperate. It will be interesting to see if anybody in the so-called Justice Department sees fit to make an issue of this. Yalin Charlie Tree is another of the key rogues in this whole parcel of rogues I'm referring to. He is a member of a Red Chinese criminal syndicate called the Four Seas Triad. One of the oaths of the Four Seas Triad refers to what happens if you are caught. If you're caught, you go to jail. You do not betray your co-conspirators or you will be killed. That is an oath that was sworn by Yalin Charlie Tree. After his role in the ChinaGate scandal was uncovered, he fled to China. He wasn't difficult to find. ABC News tracked him down and interviewed him on camera. But he proved to be too elusive for the Justice Department to go over and interview him or subpoena him. But he returned of his own initiative in early 1998 and surrendered himself to authorities, and he is being faithful to the oath he swore. He gave at least $220,000 to the re-election effort of Bill Clinton, $460,000 to the Clinton Legal Defense Trust, all of which came from illegal Asian sources. And in March of 1996, when he made this huge donation to Mr. Clinton's Legal Defense Trust, he hand-delivered for delivery to Bill Clinton a letter that originated in Red China, essentially warning the U.S. not to intervene in China's so-called internal affairs when Red China was acting in a menacing fashion toward Taiwan. And as we have seen, Mr. Clinton has adapted our policy accordingly. Yalin Charlie Tree is one of the major reasons why Costco had access to Bill Clinton. And we'll talk a little bit about Costco once again in just a second, having to do with Johnny Chung's role. One of the most unfortunate things here, one of the most degrading elements of the ChinaGate scandal is the fact that Charlie Tree is a close comrade of another gangster by the name of Ng Lap Sung. Ng Lap Sung is a mobster who is headquartered in Macau, which is province, just Portuguese colony that will be turned over to Red China this year in 1999. Ang Lap Seng wired over $1 million to bank accounts controlled by Charlie Tree. He also brought in huge briefcases full of cash for the purpose of being given to the Clinton administration and various democratic causes. Ang Lap Seng is very tight with China's Ministry of State Security, the MSS, which is their equivalent of the KGB. His primary occupation is vice. He is a major drug lord. He is also one of the major pimps on Macau. He runs a huge prostitution ring. And by virtue, if you can use the word virtue in this type of a context, of his contributions to Mr. Clinton's re-election campaign, Ang Lap Seng visited the White House at least 15 times. Ted Siong is another major player in the vice empire of Ang Lap Seng. He's an Indonesian who was raised by ethnic Chinese in Indonesia. He has a passport from Belize. He's rootless, he's stateless, he's completely disreputable. And he donated about $400,000 to Mr. Clinton's re-election campaign. He has been identified as an agent of Red China. According to the Thompson Committee report, quote, Siong worked on behalf of the Chinese government and regularly communicated with the Red Chinese embassy and consular officials at various locations in the United States. He traveled to Beijing frequently, where he reported to and was briefed by Chinese Communist Party officials. And that brings us to Johnny Chung. The case of Johnny Chung is, I think, the most interesting of all the cases we've discussed so far, the people involved as conduits of Red China's money. Johnny Chung, about a year ago, agreed to a plea bargain with federal investigators. He admitted to receiving at least $300,000 from Red China's military and giving at least $100,000 to the Bill Clinton re-election effort in 1996. Of course, Johnny Chung is epigrammatically famous for what should have been the epitaph of the Clinton administration. I see the White House as like a subway. You have to put coins in to open the gates. Johnny Chung brokered personal meetings between Bill Clinton and Lieutenant Colonel Liu Chaoying of the so-called People's Liberation Army. Liu Chaoying is involved in aerospace acquisition for Red China's army, missile technology, satellite technology, all the types of things that Bill Clinton has arranged to be transferred to Red China. It was Johnny Chung who met 3 times with General Ji Shangde of the Red Chinese military intelligence. And he was informed in those meetings, according to a fascinating article that appeared in the April 4th, 1999 Los Angeles Times. He was told, Johnny Chung was, by General G, that numerous other people were involved as conduits, funneling money into Bill Clinton's re-election effort. In April of 1998, after Chung began to cooperate with the feds, he was visited by a businessman from China. This is what the Los Angeles Times reported. Quote, in a conversation conducted in Chinese, the businessman offered Chung a carrot and a stick, advising him to keep silent about his contacts with General G. In return, Chung would receive funds sufficient to live very comfortably. But the businessman suggested that Chung and his family could have safety concerns if the offer were ignored. Furthermore, the businessman advised Chung to go to jail if necessary, assuring Chung that friends in high places would support him. The businessman even suggested that Chung could expect to be pardoned by the president. That's a remarkable promise coming from the head of Red China's military intelligence. That he could count upon, that is to say, that Chung could count upon the intervention of friends in high places and the possible intervention by the President of the United States on his behalf. How confident is Red China that they have bought and paid for Bill Clinton? I would contend that that illustrates a shockingly high level of confidence. Well, in summer of 1998, while Mr. Clinton was groveling his way through China, a hit squad arrived in California searching out Johnny Chung and his family. At one point, the FBI had dispatched 40 agents to keep Johnny Chung, his wife, and his 3 children under constant surveillance. And heaven only knows where they are to this day. When you are involved in a criminal syndicate like the mafia, if you turn on the mafia, then you are fair game for a contract. To this day, there are people who have gone into the underground after cooperating with federal investigations into the mafia who still live in the witness protection program. I contend that Red China's intelligence assets are much more ruthless and much better organized than the mafia, and they have much more influence with Bill Clinton's administration. One of the things that we need to understand in terms of the extent to which Red Chinese infiltration is going on is that one of the major fundraisers, one of the major elements of the fundraising network that funneled these illegal funds into the Bill Clinton campaign is involved in importing talent for Red China. That individual is named Maria Shah, and she is a longtime associate of Al Gore. They have a relationship that goes back to 1989. She was indicted by a U.S. federal court in 1998 for, quote, knowingly and willfully conspiring to defraud the U.S. government in matters of immigration and campaign finance. Now, the Democratic minority contribution to the Thompson Committee's report in the Senate said the following thing about Maria Shah, quote, the committee received non-public information connecting some activities she undertook while an immigration consultant in the state of California in the early to mid-1990s to Chinese government officials. In other words, she was involved as an immigration consultant helping Red China do what? Circumvent the regularly established and constituted avenues for immigration. She was bringing people into this country in ways that appeared to be at least shady and perhaps outright illegal. Now, why would she be doing this? She would be doing this, I contend, in order to bring in manpower of the sort, perhaps, that composed the hit squad that went after Johnny Chung. They have people who are in key positions who have access to the highest levels of our government. Maria Shah is very tight with Al Gore. She put together a group of shady Asian characters in 1989 for the purpose of promoting Al Gore's presidential prospects. Bill Clinton was talent scouted by Red China perhaps in the mid-1980s when Yalin Charlie Tree, this triad agent, the sleeper agent for Beijing, became a very good friend of Bill Clinton's in Little Rock. But Al Gore was talent spotted in 1989, no later than 1989, when he and Maria Shah got very, very close. Many of you remember the spectacle of the Sailai Buddhist temple fundraiser that Al Gore, the smartest man in the universe, the inventor of the internet, didn't know was a fundraiser. Okay? It was Maria Shah who organized that event and provided the money. This is something that is very important, and by way of bringing a close to this discussion, I wish to emphasize it. What should we do, and what is to be remembered, and what are the key points that we have to hit when we're discussing this with other people? The first and most important point I would bring up with respect to Maria Shah and the future of the investigation is it's not just Bill Clinton. Al Gore is just as deeply involved. And there are other people who are probably just as deeply compromised as either of those two. Al Gore, once again, was the bag man for the Sailai Temple caper and for other enterprises. We remember how Bill Clinton developed a fetish over the meaning of specific words. Depends upon what the meaning of the word is, was one of the things that we heard quite a bit regarding Mr. Clinton's perjurious testimony. We've heard Al Gore talk about how there's no controlling legal authority for certain types of illegal campaign fundraising activities. That's something we should rehearse to people, is that there is a controlling legal authority when you're talking about acting as a conduit for illegal campaign contributions that amount to bribes from a hostile foreign power. The second point I'd like to make in closing, don't let the Republican Party use ChinaGate as an applause line. Too often we have seen how Republican politicians will thoughtfully furrow their brow and utter indignant sound bites and do nothing. We cannot allow that to happen with ChinaGate. It is literally a matter of life and death. We should hold Senator Inhofe accountable for saying that. We should tell Senator Inhofe, act as if your words mean something to you. And whenever we hear a Republican politician, they are the majority party right now in the Congress, venting wrath and outrage over what has gone on in the course of ChinaGate, we should ask, what are you going to do about it? Will you simply use this as a pitch in your direct mail fundraising, or do you intend to do something materially to improve our circumstance? Don't let them get away with giving us applause lines and then very carefully sweeping it under a very large and bulging rug. Another point I would make is that this would be a good single issue if you're looking for reasons to vote against an incumbent. I wouldn't make what a challenger says about ChinaGate to be the single issue upon which I would vote for him, but if you become convinced that your incumbent congressman or senator is somebody who cannot bring himself to take an assertive position on the issue of treason, you've got no reason to vote for him. And you should help people understand that as well. One of the things I would recommend by way of action is to buy and to make available to your friends this book, Year of the Rat, by two very capable congressional investigators, Edward Timberlake and William C. Triplett. It is a tremendously useful volume, and it contains a lot of information, in many instances similar to what I've said this evening. Some of what I have said has been taken from this book. It duplicates a lot of the material that the New American has been putting out since late 1996. This is not an enterprise in which we should be jealous for taking credit. We simply have to do the tough work involved in helping the public understand exactly how serious our situation is. I would also commend to you the value of the New American special issue on ChinaGate, ChinaGate Treason in the White House. This is the February 15th, 1999 special issue of the New American, dealing in some depth and perhaps at greater length with some of the issues that we've discussed this evening. A very valuable tool in helping people understand the extent to which our national security has been compromised. We also have available at the literature table and elsewhere available through our American Opinion Book Services the reprint of the Watchdog special issue that was put out by the National Impeach Clinton Action Committee dealing with ChinaGate. This is a very valuable resource as well because it is small and lightweight and easily digestible, and it contains a flow chart illustrating the bribery feedback loop that exists with respect to one key element of the ChinaGate scandal, which is the payoff that went to Bill Clinton by way of a couple of sources, Johnny Chung among them, in exchange for missile technology. You have here documented and graphically illustrated the reality of a money trail that leads from the highest echelons of the Red Chinese Politburo directly into the Oval Office of Bill Clinton. This is a very valuable resource for helping people understand how ChinaGate works, the basic mechanisms through which our betrayal has been consummated. And this is something, once again, which is available and very useful. The last thing I would recommend for those of you who have not done so already would be to join the John Birch Society. This is a good idea for many, many reasons, not the least of which is the fact that it answers the question that I'm constantly asked when I'm in a conversation with somebody about the subject, which is, what on earth can I do if the Congress, the Senate, are not inclined to hold this individual responsible for what he has done? What on earth could I do that would be of any use? Well, the John Birch Society is not a placebo. It won't make you feel better, but not do anything materially to improve your situation. There are placebo organizations. I would contend that altogether too frequently the Republican Party acts as a political placebo. That's not what we're about. We're about going out and restoring the health of the American body politic. Conspiracies of the sort that we're describing when we talk about ChinaGate are opportunistic infections. They tend to infect body politics that have become corrupted already. Our body politic has a natural immune system that we need to refurbish, and that is the Constitution of the United States. But the only way that it can be refurbished and enforced is if an aware, intelligent, motivated electorate will enforce that Constitution. Okay? We are, if you will, sort of the antibodies in a way. I hate to put it that way because we're always accused of being anti-everything. We're pro-freedom, we're pro-Constitution, we're pro-individual rights, but we act as antibodies when we're dealing with the cancer of collectivism and the canker of conspiracy. Join the John Birch Society and be part of this endeavor. It will make you feel better, but more importantly, it will help things get better, because the only way that things will get better is if a critical mass is reached within the electorate regarding a knowledge of how these things have happened, how our national security has been undermined in exchange for bribes given to the President of the United States. The John Birch Society is not the type of an organization that will flinch from unpopular facts. There's too much flinching going on. So don't flinch from the reality of what's happening, and if you have the opportunity this evening to join the John Birch Society, I heartily entreat you, do not flinch from that opportunity. We could use your help. Your country needs you, because if it's going to be done, it has to be done by people like us. And I would heartily extend that invitation once again to those of you who have not availed yourself of that opportunity. Our situation is grave. I don't underestimate the importance and the severity of the information I've discussed this evening. But bear in mind, once again, ultimately we can only be defeated by enemies within. The only way that enemies within can prosper is if they are allowed to proceed in their perfidious work unmolested by a well-educated and motivated electorate. Please join with us in educating the electorate and restoring our Constitution, and let us reestablish the rule of law and restore our national security and preserve our sovereignty. May God bless us in this endeavor. Thank you very much for listening to me this evening.